There's a phrase you've probably heard 100 times if you grew up in church, and I'd bet you never actually stopped to think about what it really means. Made in the image of God. Genesis 1:27 says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." It's one of the most quoted verses in the entire Bible. It's on church posters, in self-worth Bible studies, in sermons about human value, on youth camp T-shirts. And I always had this vague idea that it meant we're somehow like God. Maybe it's because we can reason. Maybe it's because we have souls. Maybe it's because we can make moral choices. Maybe it's simply because we're self-aware in a way that, as far as we know, no other animal in creation is. I remember hearing this verse in pretty much every church context imaginable. In Sunday school with cartoon drawings of Adam and Eve in the garden. At youth retreats trying to prove you have worth even if nobody else compliments you. At funerals trying to comfort the family by saying that person went back to the image they always were. And the strange thing is, in none of those settings did anyone ever actually stop to explain what the word image was technically doing there. It was treated as obvious, like everybody already knew, when in reality the explanation most of us got was vague enough to mean almost anything. But the more I dug into this, the more I started to think we might be looking at this verse completely wrong, or at least missing a layer of meaning so significant that it changes the whole reading of the text. Because once you start looking at the original Hebrew text, and especially once you understand how the ancient world actually thought about divine images, idol statues, and royalty itself, there's a whole layer of meaning here that practically nobody ever taught you in church. And honestly, once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's important when we read the Bible to try to understand the text the way someone living back then would have understood it, not through our Western, individualistic, modern eyes. We read Genesis 1 thinking in terms of biology, soul, psychology. But whoever first heard this text, more than 3,000 years ago, didn't have any of those categories in their head. They had something else entirely. They knew exactly what an image was because they lived surrounded by them in temples, in public squares, on the borders of empires. And that raises the question I want to answer today. What does it actually mean to be made in the image of God? Because it might not be what you think. And I promise you, if you stick with me to the end, you'll walk away with a much deeper and richer understanding of one of the most obscure and most misunderstood details in the entire Bible. A detail that, in my opinion, changes how you read not just Genesis, but Exodus, the prophets, the Gospels, and even the last chapter of Revelation. So here's what I want to explore today. We're going to look at what image of God might actually mean once you understand the ancient context of idols and royalty. We're going to see why some scholars think the word image should be understood more as a function, almost like a verb, rather than a noun, something we possess tucked away inside us. And there's a fascinating connection to one of the 10 Commandments that, honestly, I'd never heard before digging into this. And at the end, we're going to look at what this means for the future, because there's something in Revelation about reigning forever that I think connects to all of this in a way I didn't expect. So, without further ado, let's get into it. One more thing before we start. If you're into this kind of deep dive into the strangest, most overlooked parts of the Bible, consider subscribing to the channel. It's free, and it genuinely helps us keep making this kind of content. And as always, thank you for watching. To understand what Genesis might be getting at when it talks about humanity being made in the image of God, we first need to talk about something that seems completely unrelated: idols. I know that sounds weird, but stick with me because it's going to click fast. In the ancient Near East, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Babylon, all the cultures surrounding Israel, there was a very specific and genuinely interesting understanding of what divine images were and how they functioned. And the most surprising part is that when these cultures crafted an idol or a statue of a god, they weren't nearly as naive as we tend to assume when we read the Bible mocking idols made of stone and wood. They didn't literally believe that clay or wooden statue was the god itself. The way we imagine a toddler thinking a doll is an actual person. Ancient Near Eastern theologians actually had a pretty sophisticated, almost philosophical system worked out. The statue was understood as a physical representation of the deity, a kind of localized presence of the god inside that specific temple. And they had elaborate rituals to activate the statue, essentially inviting the divine presence to come dwell there, to move in, so to speak, into that object. And it's worth stressing that this wasn't some fringe belief held by simple, superstitious people. It was the official, sophisticated theology taught in the temple, schools of Babylon and Assyria, debated by priests, scribes who spent their entire lives studying ritual texts, religious calendars, and lists of divine names. Assuming ancient people were naive and thought pieces of wood were literally gods is, ironically, a shallow reading that ignores how complex their actual thinking was. And understanding that complexity is exactly what's about to make Genesis 1 shine in a completely new way. There's a famous Mesopotamian example of this. It was a ritual called the opening of the mouth, Mise Pi, if you want the technical term, where priests would symbolically open the mouth of the freshly carved statue so it could, essentially, eat the offerings and speak through the temple's oracles. They'd even perform a ritual where they symbolically cut off the hands of the craftsman who carved the statue, throwing his tools into a river, publicly declaring that the god had made itself, completely denying any human involvement in its own creation. Think about that. They knew perfectly well that a flesh and blood human being had spent weeks carving that block of wood or stone, and yet the entire ritual existed to erase that fact from collective memory, because what mattered wasn't the statue's material origin, but the function it took on once activated. And that ritual wasn't a one-time thing either. It unfolded over several days, with nighttime processions carrying the statue to a riverbank, repeated ritual washings, burning incense, incantations recited by different categories of priests in a specific sequence. It was, essentially, an installation ceremony, almost like an inauguration, except instead of crowning a human king, they were formally installing a divine presence inside an object that, minutes earlier, was just carved wood or stone. That's exactly why scholars studying these religions describe this process as ontological. It's not about appearance. It's about the very being of the thing changing categories. And that backdrop is exactly what makes the biblical polemic against idols, which we see in passages like Isaiah 44, so sharp and so specific. Isaiah describes, almost with sarcastic humor, a man who cuts down a tree, uses half the wood to build a fire and roast his dinner, and uses the other half to carve a god he then kneels before and prays to for salvation. Isaiah's point isn't that pagans were too dumb to realize the statue was just wood. He knew perfectly well they had a sophisticated theology about activation and divine presence. His point is more devastating than that. Even with all the ritual, all the theological sophistication, that God remained ultimately incapable of doing anything on its own. It had to be carried, it had to be manufactured. It needed human hands to exist, unlike the living God of Israel, who made humans with his own hands, not the other way around. Here's what I think is really important to understand about all this. The image didn't need to physically resemble the God. That wasn't the point at all. The image's purpose was functional, not aesthetic. It represented the God's authority and presence in that specific place. So when people went to the temple and saw the image, they were encountering the God's representative presence there, not a photo of him, not an accurate portrait of what he really looked like, but the official point of contact between the divine world and the human world. The image did the God's work in that location. It received offerings on his behalf. It delivered oracle responses on his behalf. It represented his will, and this concept extended to kings as well. Because in the ancient world, kings understood themselves in a very similar way to the statues in the temples. The king was seen as the image of God on earth, or the image of the gods, depending on the specific culture. Egyptian pharaohs were described in official texts as the living image of Ra or Horus. Mesopotamian rulers, especially Assyrian kings, called themselves the image of Enlil, or the image of Marduk in royal inscriptions. All of them were viewed as living images of the gods, representing divine authority to common people who would never have direct access to a deity's presence. A concrete example of this comes from an Egyptian text known as the Instruction for Merekare, a wisdom document addressed to a future pharaoh, probably written well before Israel existed as a nation. In that text, the Creator God is described as saying he made common humanity in his image, in a pretty vague, generic sense of kinship. But when the text talks about the pharaoh specifically, the language shifts in tone and weight. The pharaoh is called the image of God on earth in an exclusive, functional, almost administrative sense, far stronger than anything said about the rest of humanity. That distinction, common humanity having a vague link to the divine, royalty having official image status, is exactly the pattern that repeats across virtually every culture neighboring Israel. And that's exactly the pattern Genesis 1 blows up by applying the strongest language, the language reserved for royalty, to every single human being without distinction. The Hittites, another powerful empire of the era, had a similar practice. Kings would erect stone reliefs depicting themselves in a posture of worship before the gods, while simultaneously calling themselves beloved of the storm god, with an authority that surpassed any ordinary priest. And Babylonian royal texts, especially the ones surrounding Hammurabi, describe the king receiving the symbol of justice and the scepter directly from the god Shamash, a scene, incidentally, carved into the top of the very steel where the famous law code was engraved, which anyone walking through the public square could see. The king, and only the king, in the position of receiving authority directly from the divine. But kings did one more thing that's really interesting, and I think it's the key to really understanding Genesis 1. They erected statues of themselves in distant parts of the kingdom, on frontiers, in conquered cities, in places where they couldn't be physically present at all times. And those statues represented the king's authority there, functioning almost like a legal and political extension of the man himself. For example, if you saw the king's image standing in your city's main square, you understood immediately that you were under his rule, that his laws applied there, even if the king himself was physically hundreds or thousands of miles away, sitting in his palace back in the capital of the empire. There are actual archaeological records of this, steles and monuments that Assyrian and Egyptian kings erected in newly conquered territories, specifically to mark that territory as now belonging to the king's sphere of authority, even if the king himself never returned to that place after the military campaign. The image stood there doing the work of presence that the king's physical body couldn't do. And this wasn't seen as strange or superstitious by people at the time. It was, essentially, the ancient equivalent of a national flag or an official coat of arms. A functional symbol of jurisdiction, not an attempt to magically clone the king. So when we get to Genesis 1, the original audience, Israelites who had just come out of Egypt, or who were hearing these accounts compiled centuries later, surrounded by empires that worked exactly this way, would have heard, "Let us make man in our image," and understood the concept immediately. No explanation needed, because everybody knew what images were and how they functioned. It was the standard political and religious vocabulary of the entire ancient world. And this is where Genesis does something that would have been absolutely shocking, almost scandalous to the original audience. Because in every other ancient Near Eastern culture, without exception, only the king was the image of God. It was an exclusive, restricted privilege. Only royalty. Only the pharaoh, only the emperor, the great king, as the Assyrians called themselves. But Genesis says God made humanity, all of humanity, with no qualification whatsoever in his image. Not just kings, not just priests, not just a chosen elite, every single human being, male and female. And that, at the end of the day, is an absurdly radical idea for the context in which it was written, because it's basically democratizing a concept that in every neighboring culture was reserved exclusively for the ruling class, for the absolute top of the social pyramid. Genesis seems to be saying that every human being, man, woman, rich or poor, powerful or weak, free or enslaved, is a real representative of the divine king. There's no hierarchy of image in God's creation. The slave carries the same representative dignity as the pharaoh, And in ancient Egypt or Babylon, that would have simply been unthinkable. And this is where it gets genuinely interesting, because this isn't the only hidden layer in this text. Hold that thought, because we're going to come back to how this detail alone should completely change the way we see the value of every person we encounter day to day. And there's one more thing worth pausing on here, because it reinforces this radical democratization even further. Genesis 1:27 ends with male and female, he created them. It's not just generic man being crowned the image of God while woman is left out, the way some older, unfortunately sexist readings tried to suggest throughout church history. The Hebrew text is explicit. Zakar unikeva, male and female, both equally included in the same declaration of image, in the same grammatical breath. In an era when practically no neighboring culture would give a common woman any kind of official status of divine representation, and honestly, many didn't even give that status to common men, Genesis explicitly includes women in the same category of representative dignity as men. That's radical twice over. Radical for including common people, and radical again for explicitly including women among those common people. Now, of course, this isn't the only way to read Genesis 1:27. And I think it's important to be honest about that before we go further. Throughout church history, the most common interpretation has always revolved around some capacity or quality we humans possess that would make us similar to God. The first common theory is that the image of God is in our rationality, our unique capacity to reason abstractly, to do logic, to contemplate complex ideas like math, philosophy, theology. Makes sense at first glance. Animals don't do that, and we do. The second common theory is that the image is in our capacity to love, to relate deeply, sacrificially, voluntarily. God is love, 1 John says, so maybe the image is this relational capacity. The third theory is that the image is in our capacity for moral choice, free will, the ability to distinguish right from wrong and choose between them, something supposedly setting us apart from creatures that act on pure instinct. And the fourth theory, maybe the most common one in the churches I know, is that the image of God is simply our soul, an immaterial spiritual substance God placed inside every human being, which would be the true seat of our likeness to Him. And look, I get the appeal of each of these readings. They all capture something true about the human experience. We are, in fact, rational in a way that seems unique. We love in a way that seems to transcend pure instinct. We make moral choices that seem to carry real weight. And the idea of the soul has deep roots in a large part of Christian tradition. But, and here's the but, I think we need to take seriously each of these readings. Once you press on it a little, starts to crack. If the image is specifically tied to our rationality, what happens to someone who suffers severe brain damage, or who develops advanced dementia and loses the capacity for abstract logic? Do they lose the image of God along with their memory? That seems deeply wrong to affirm, but it's exactly where that theory leads you if you're consistent with it. If the image is in our capacity to love voluntarily and consciously, what happens to a newborn who hasn't yet developed the neurological capacity to love intentionally the way the theory describes? or someone in a deep coma? Are they less the image of God during that time? If the image is in our capacity for conscious moral choice, what do we say about a very young child or someone with a severe intellectual disability that prevents them from processing complex moral dilemmas? Do they carry less of the image than a neurotypical adult? You see the problem. Every time we try to pin the image of God to a specific capacity, no matter which one, we end up unintentionally creating a sliding scale of humanity. Some humans would have more image, others less, and theoretically someone could even lose the image entirely, depending on circumstance. And that simply doesn't square with how the Bible treats human dignity anywhere else. It doesn't square with the protection Mosaic law gives the vulnerable. It doesn't square with how the prophets defend the poor and the orphaned. It doesn't square with how Jesus treats the people his society considered lesser. And there's a fifth problem, maybe the subtlest of all, that I think is worth mentioning. If the image of God is in some capacity we have and animals don't, that implicitly suggests the difference between humans and animals is a difference of degree. As if a sufficiently intelligent chimpanzee with sophisticated enough reasoning could theoretically approach the image of God by accumulating enough capacity. But the traditional capacity theories never satisfactorily resolve that boundary. Exactly where, on a scale of animal intelligence, does the image of God begin? The answer, historically, always ends up being somewhat arbitrary, somewhat based on intuition, and not on any clear biblical criterion. The status reading resolves this with almost surgical clarity. It's not a question of degree of capacity. It's a question of category. God declared humanity, and only humanity as his designated representatives, regardless of any intelligence comparison with other creatures. So this conventional explanation might be incomplete. It might be right in identifying genuinely good things about being human, but wrong in trying to locate the image of God inside a specific capacity that can vary, grow, shrink, or disappear. And this is exactly where the ancient Near Eastern context we just built starts to offer a completely different way out. With that context in mind, let's look again, more carefully, at what Genesis might actually be doing here, because I think there's something really curious going on in the Hebrew text itself, not just in the cultural backdrop. If you look at the actual Hebrew text of Genesis 1, verses 26 through 27, there's a grammatical detail that matters a lot, one that most English translations simply can't capture. The traditional translation says, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." And for most of church history, we've read that preposition in as meaning we possess something, as if we had the image of God built into us somehow, tucked inside some part of us. Maybe it's our rationality, maybe it's our capacity to love, maybe it's even our creative capacity, some internal quality, some spiritual ingredient that makes us like God. But here's what's interesting. There's a Hebrew grammatical feature called the Beit Essentiae. I'm probably not pronouncing that perfectly, but it's sometimes also called the bait of predication or bait of identity. And I know Hebrew grammar sounds incredibly boring for a YouTube video, but stick with me. because this genuinely matters for everything that follows. When this preposition, the letter beit in Hebrew, which we normally translate as in or with, is used this specific way, it doesn't mean possessing something. It means functioning as something, being identified as something. It's a term about status or role, not necessarily about material or spiritual possession. And this use of the beit preposition shows up elsewhere in the Old Testament in a way that helps clarify the pattern. In Exodus 6:3, God says he appeared to the patriarchs as El Shaddai, using this same structure to indicate in what capacity, in what function he revealed himself, not that he was inside a name. In Psalm 39, the psalmist describes a person walking around as a shadow. Beit used to describe a condition, a mode of being, not a possession. This grammatical pattern shows up often enough in ancient Hebrew literature that scholars of Semitic linguistics treat it as a recognized category, not as some forced interpretation conveniently bent to fit a nice thesis. So what would happen? And this is what some biblical scholars are arguing with pretty serious academic weight. For example, Michael Heiser, who worked extensively with ancient Semitic linguistics and ancient Near Eastern context. If this should be read not as "let us make man in our image" in the sense of possession, but as "let us make man as our image," not possessing an image, but being the image itself. We don't have the image tucked away in some internal compartment. We are the image from the first moment of our existence to the last. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that seems like a pretty subtle difference for someone who doesn't study Hebrew, but why does it matter enough to justify an entire video? This is where I think it really becomes something huge, something that changes the whole game. Because if the image is some quality we possess, some attribute, some ability, some spiritual ingredient tucked inside us, we immediately run into the same uncomfortable problems we just raised about dementia, about babies, about disability. But if imaging is something you do, or rather, something you are simply by existing as human, if it's a verb, a function, a matter of status rather than measurable capacity, then suddenly every human being at every stage of development is equally an image bearer of God. A fetus in the womb is an image bearer. A newborn who can't even focus their eyes yet is an image bearer. A person with severe intellectual disability is an image bearer. An elderly person in the most advanced stage of Alzheimer's, who no longer even recognizes their own name, is still fully an image bearer of God. And it's not about what that person can do, produce, or process cognitively. It's literally about who they are from the first instant of their existence to the last. And I think it's interesting to note that this status reading also resolves a textual problem that always bothered me a bit in Genesis 9, after the flood, when God establishes the prohibition against shedding human blood by saying, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." Notice that God's argument there isn't because man is rational, or because man has a soul. The explicit and sole argument cited in the text is the image. The dignity that protects human life against violence isn't anchored in any specific capacity the victim would need to demonstrate to earn protection. It's anchored exclusively in image, status, present equally in any human being, victim or aggressor, strong or weak, useful or seemingly useless in the eyes of any society. Hold that thought, because we're coming back to it with more force when we get to the practical implications. Because, honestly, I think this single shift in perspective carries enormous ethical weight, the kind that changes real debates we face today. So, what does imaging God actually mean in practice? Well, look at what comes right after in Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. This is what biblical scholars call the dominion mandate. God seems to be giving humanity a concrete, almost administrative task: fill the earth with more image bearers and wisely manage God's creation on his behalf, like a vice regent tending the territory of a king who's physically absent but present through his image. Here's how I started thinking about this. God is the king of the universe, right? But in Genesis 1, he's creating the entire cosmos, and a lot of Old Testament scholars tend to see this passage as God building a cosmic temple, the whole universe from the heavens to the earth, functioning as his personal temple. And what did every ancient Near Eastern temple have, without exception, inside its innermost sanctuary? A divine image, exactly like we just saw in the cultural context. But instead of making a statue of stone or wood, standing motionless and inert, God does something far more interesting, far more radical. He makes living, breathing, intelligent images that move and decide and create on their own, humanity. So we are God's representatives on earth, where God isn't visibly present, and he isn't physically walking through gardens the way he walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. We represent him. We carry out his will. We extend his wise rule over all creation, planting, cultivating, administrating, building culture, justice, and order. To be human is, in other words, to image God. It's what we are by definition, not some extra task we choose to accept or decline as an optional life project. And I think it's worth pausing here for a second to note something that gets missed in most quick readings of Genesis 1. Notice that the dominion mandate comes immediately after the declaration of the image, in the same breath, almost as if they were one sentence split into two parts. First, let us make man as our image. Then, without any pause in the text, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every living thing that moves on the earth. That's not an editing coincidence. It's the grammatical structure showing that image and task are the same thing seen from two angles. The image is the status. The dominion is the function that naturally flows from that status. You can't separate the two without distorting the text. And that, by the way, is another point in favor of Heiser's reading. If the image were some abstract internal capacity, why would it come immediately paired with a task as concrete and practical as govern the animals and cultivate the land? It makes far more sense if the image itself is already an office, and offices come with attached responsibilities. It's worth noting this image followed by task pattern isn't exclusive to Genesis 1 either. It shows up again in different words in Psalm 8, one of the most beautiful poems in the whole Old Testament on this theme. The psalmist asks, marveling as he looks up at the starry sky, "What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him?" And the answer he himself gives is remarkable. "Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet." Notice the language of coronation, of honor, of dominion, royal vocabulary applied to every human being, not just to one specific king. The psalmist is, without using the technical word image, describing exactly the same reality Genesis 1 describes. Humanity crowned, humanity with dominion, humanity representing God's authority over visible creation. And this is where there's a connection I'd never made before. One I think is one of the richest discoveries in this whole research process. And honestly, when I first heard this, it completely changed how I read an extremely familiar passage, one most of us memorized as kids without ever really understanding its weight. Because if we carry the image of God, if we represent him on earth the way of vice, Regent carries the authority of a distant king, then we also carry his name. And that brings us to one of the 10 commandments that I think we might have gotten wrong for practically our entire church lives. So this is a connection I'd never made before, but as soon as I heard it, it just blew my mind, and I think it's going to do the same for you. You know the third commandment, right? You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. I always had the impression this was about cussing. Like, don't use God or Jesus Christ as a curse word when you stub your toe on the coffee table. Maybe it's not about using his name flippantly in casual conversation. And look, I'm not saying those things are good or should be encouraged, obviously. But after studying this, I don't think that's primarily what the commandment is getting at, in its original sense, for the audience who first received it at Sinai. The Hebrew word translated take in most English Bibles is nasa, and it generally means to lift up, to carry, or to bear. The same kind of verb you'd use to describe someone carrying a heavy load on their back, or lifting an object off the ground. For example, throughout the entire Old Testament, this same word is translated bear or carry 61 times, lift 64 times, and only take 49 times, which is already revealing because it shows take isn't even the most frequent translation of this root anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. So a more literal reading, one more faithful to the word's original weight, would be, "You shall not bear the name of the Lord your God in vain," or "You shall not carry the name of the Lord your God in an empty, hollow way." And this is where everything clicks perfectly with what we've been building block by block. If we are the images of God, his image bearers, his representatives on earth, then we carry his name the entire time, in every interaction, in every decision. We represent him, whether we consciously realize it or not. In the ancient world, carrying someone's name, whether a king's, a family's, a clan's, meant you functioned as the official representative, the legitimate agent of that person or institution before others. So the commandment might not primarily be about profane speech or verbal blasphemy, and it might be much more about misrepresenting God through your daily behavior, carrying his name in an unworthy way, claiming to represent him while living in a way that doesn't reflect who he really is. Think about it like this. Imagine you work for a big, well-known company, and you walk around town with the logo stamped on your shirt, publicly presenting yourself as that brand's representative in every interaction you have. But you start treating customers badly, lying about the products you're selling, acting unethically in your dealings, maybe even scamming some people. You'd technically be carrying the company's name in vain, using its authority and reputation to do something that completely contradicts everything it's supposed to stand for. Or imagine an ambassador sent from one country to represent his nation's interest on foreign soil. The ambassador carries his home nation's name and authority into every meeting, every signature, every public statement he makes. But if he acts foolishly, corruptly, or betrays his own country's core values while using the title and diplomatic protection that country gave him, he ends up, in practice, carrying that nation's name in vain, emptying the meaning of the office he holds. And I think that might be exactly what this commandment is getting at, in its deepest and most original sense. We carry God's name because we carry His image. The two concepts are deeply intertwined, almost impossible to separate. We are His representatives on earth, all the time, in every sphere of life. And taking His name in vain means representing Him falsely, claiming to be His people, claiming to follow Him, while living in practical rebellion against everything He stands for, or saying we follow Him while our daily attitudes contradict everything He represents in front of the people watching. And that's genuinely interesting, right? And this also connects back to the imaging question we established in earlier sections. Because if the image of God is fundamentally about representation and status, then carrying the image well means accurately reflecting who God is to the watching world, almost like a living embassy. And carrying that image poorly, in a distorted way, that is, in concrete daily practice, taking His name in vain. And from a New Testament perspective, there's a verse in 2 Timothy 2:19 where Paul says clearly, "Let everyone who names the name of the Lord depart from iniquity." So if you publicly claim His name, if you carry His image in front of others, your life should probably, in some consistent, even if imperfect way, reflect that reality you're claiming. And that might explain, in a way I'd never considered before, why Jesus consistently seemed angrier at religious leaders in the Gospels than at practically any other group, angrier even than at the occupying Romans, angrier than at tax collectors or the prostitutes He encountered. They carried God's name publicly and prominently. In other words, they claimed to represent Him before the people, wore religious robes, held positions of spiritual authority, but they were giving people a completely distorted picture of what God is really like.
The user
making
prompt
Him seem
explicitly
harsh,
requests
distant,
no
and
dialogue
legalistic,
and no ambient
when
sound.
the whole point of Jesus coming was to show that God is actually gracious, close, and merciful. That, in the most literal and heaviest sense of the word, is carrying His name in vain. And that made Jesus genuinely furious, not at ordinary people's ordinary sin, but at the false representation of who God is, coming precisely from those who should have known Him best. So, here's what we've seen so far, and I want you to hold onto this clearly before we move on. You were made as the image of God, not merely given an image. You are His representative on earth. You carry His name in every interaction you have, whether you realize it or not. Your job, or at least what you were originally designed for, is to accurately reflect who He is and exercise His wise rule over creation. That is, at the end of the day, your most fundamental identity. That's your primary purpose. That's literally what it means to be human. But here's the problem. And this is what makes this whole biblical story both heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. Because we kind of messed it up spectacularly, honestly. And I've been holding onto this part of the connection since the start of this research, because I think it's the real heart of everything. Humanity was supposed to image God faithfully, right? We were supposed to carry His name with honor, represent Him accurately to the rest of watching creation. And of course, going back to the Garden of Eden, we simply didn't do that. Adam and Eve, the first image bearers, the first official representatives of the living God on earth, chose to listen to the serpent's voice instead of God's voice. They basically abdicated their role as representatives, trading the king's word for the word of a rebellious creature. And that failure to image God faithfully, that rebellion at the heart of the garden, introduced sin and death into the entire world, twisting the function humanity was supposed to carry out. Now, and this is important, the image wasn't destroyed by the fall. We're still the image of God, still His representatives. That status doesn't disappear with sin, which is why even after Genesis 9, after the flood, God still speaks of human life as sacred precisely because of the image we carry. But at the end of the day, that image became corrupted in its function. We started representing Him poorly, in a distorted, selfish, violent way. And I think the entire biblical story, from Genesis to Revelation, becomes this long, patient narrative about restoring humanity to its proper function as God's faithful image bearers. For example, hold that thought because it's going to connect with full force in a bit. Israel was specifically called to be, according to Exodus 19, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That is, an entire nation that would image God faithfully to the world around it, concretely demonstrating what life looks like when humans live under God's wise rule in practice, not just in theory. But Israel, very evidently throughout the entire biblical narrative, repeatedly failed at this. They carried God's name as His chosen people, but represented Him poorly to the nations. They started worshiping the idols of neighboring peoples. They oppressed the poor and orphaned within their own community. They sought political security in alliances with Egypt or Assyria instead of trusting the God who had freed them from Egypt. And the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, each in their own way, call this out constantly, almost exhaustively across hundreds of pages. You see this throughout the entire Old Testament, God essentially saying, through the mouth of these prophets, "You carry my name. You're supposed to be representing me faithfully to the nations around you. But look at how you're living. You're, in practice, taking my name in vain in front of the entire watching world." Ezekiel 36 explicitly says Israel profaned God's name among the nations where they were exiled. The language of profaning the name is practically identical in spirit to the third commandment. And it's not just one isolated verse. If you trace it, This pattern repeats itself in an almost exhausting way throughout the entire Old Testament, and I think that repetition is exactly what proves the point. In Exodus 32, still at the foot of Mount Sinai, with the tablets of the law freshly delivered, the people already cast a golden idol and declare that calf brought them out of Egypt. An almost comically ironic inversion if it weren't so tragic. Because the very deliverance that should prove only the living God deserves representation gets credited to a dead, mute image. In Judges, the cycle repeats so many times the book practically becomes a refrain. The people forget, worship Canaanite idols, suffer oppression, cry out to God, get rescued, and forget again. In 1 Kings 18 on Mount Carmel, Elijah directly confronts the prophets of Baal, mocking them because their God doesn't answer. Cry louder. Maybe he's meditating or traveling or sleeping. In a scene that only makes sense because the people of Israel, the people who should be imaging the living God, were trying to split their loyalty between a God who speaks and idols that stay silent. And the prophet Hosea uses an even more visceral image to describe this failure to represent God faithfully. He compares Israel to an unfaithful wife, running after other lovers, other nations, other gods, while still carrying her husband's name. There's no reading Hosea 1-3 without feeling the emotional weight of that. It's not just breaking an abstract religious rule. It's a betrayal of identity. A nation carrying God's name while living as though it belonged to someone else. But then, and this is where the story, after so much accumulated weight and failure, gets genuinely interesting, genuinely full of hope. God himself becomes human in Jesus Christ. Jesus is called the image of God in several central places in the New Testament, in a way that can't be accidental or linguistic coincidence. For example, 2 Corinthians 4 literally says Christ, who is the image of God. Colossians 1:15 says he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Hebrews 1:3 says he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, using almost technical minting language, like a coin bearing the exact image of the emperor who ordered it struck. Jesus is the perfect image bearer. He's what a true human being, fully functional in their original vocation, looks like. The true image of God, the one who perfectly represents the Father, with no distortion, no corruption, no failure of representation whatsoever. He even says, directly and almost shockingly for the disciples who heard it in John 14:9, that whoever has seen him has seen the Father. That sounds like perfect imaging. Perfect representation with no intermediary distorting the message. And Jesus does, in the concrete practice of his life, what Israel was supposed to do, what Adam was supposed to do, what all of humanity was supposed to do from the beginning. He carries God's name faithfully, without exception, all the way to the cross. In John 17, in his final prayer before his arrest, Jesus prays to the Father and says, "I have manifested your name to the people whom you gave me out of the world." Jesus carried the name. He represented God perfectly before disciples, Pharisees, Romans, hungry crowds, and grieving friends. He imaged God without corruption, without distortion, never taking that name in vain for even a second of his earthly life. And I find it fascinating how the Gospels seem to deliberately build Jesus as both the new Adam and the true Israel at the same time, almost as if correcting both failures of imaging at once. Think about Matthew 4. Jesus is led into the wilderness for 40 days, the same number of years Israel spent in the wilderness after the Exodus, and is tempted at exactly the points where Israel failed: hunger, testing God, and idolatry through political power. Where Israel grumbled, doubted, and bowed to other gods, Jesus responds by quoting Deuteronomy, resisting perfectly. Where Adam, in a garden full of abundance, gave in over a single forbidden tree, Jesus, in a wilderness of total scarcity, remains faithful. It's as if the entire script of human failure is being rewritten, scene by scene, with the opposite outcome. Paul captures exactly this idea in Romans 5, explicitly calling Jesus the last Adam, the direct point of comparison with the first Adam, but reversing the outcome. Where the first Adam brought sin and death through disobedience, the last Adam brings righteousness and life through perfect obedience. It's the same category, humanity imaging God, except one example failed completely, and the other fulfilled it perfectly. And then, through his death and resurrection, he opens a concrete, real, historical path for us to be restored as faithful image bearers, not just forgiven, but actually restored to the original function Adam lost. Because here's what seems to happen when you're united to Christ by faith, according to the consistent testimony of the New Testament. You actually, progressively, begin to be transformed into his image. You're being restored to your original design as a faithful representative of God on earth, a little more each day. Paul puts this beautifully in 2 Corinthians 3:18. And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another, for this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. We're being actively conformed to the image of Christ, who is himself the perfect, undistorted image of God. And Paul repeats this same idea in at least 2 other central places, which suggests it wasn't a passing thought but a structural piece of his theology. In Romans 8:29, he says God predestined them to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers, explicitly using the same Greek word for image, icon, that the Greek translators of the Old Testament used to translate the Hebrew word from Genesis 1. It's not a new word, it's the direct continuation of the same vocabulary. In Colossians 3:10, he talks about the believer who has put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. Again, the language of creation and image reappearing together, almost like a textual echo of Genesis 1:27, now applied to the believer's spiritual ray, creation rather than the world's original creation. So the corruption that entered through Adam's fall is being actively healed, person by person, and we're being restored to our proper function as image bearers, not through some superficial moral reform, but through a real transformation of identity. Pause and read that again, because I genuinely think it's one of the most beautiful things in this whole investigation. The same image we distorted in Eden through Adam and Eve's disobedience is the same image being actively restored right now, inside you, if you're united to Christ by faith. The problem and the solution revolve around exactly the same concept. And that finally brings us to the future, to the final destiny of this entire story. Because I don't think the biblical narrative ends with us just being reasonably decent representatives of God on earth for 70 or 80 short years, and then simply floating off to some vague spiritual heaven, disconnected from body and matter, somewhere undefined. The Bible actually seems to have a much more robust, much more physical, much more concrete vision of the future than that simplified version we sometimes hear at funerals. Revelation 22 describes the new heavens and new earth, the final restoration of everything that's been broken since Eden. And it's precisely in Revelation 22 that there's this absolutely incredible image. No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. And night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. Did you catch that? Read it again if you need to. His name will be on their foreheads. The same mark, the same visible, public identification we've been talking about this whole time, ever since the third commandment. We're going to carry his name openly, visibly, eternally, at the end of the day, no longer hidden, no longer distorted by sin, but fully visible for all creation to see. And they will reign forever and ever. Read that line again. The dominion mandate from Genesis 1, fill the earth and exercise wise dominion over all creation, the original task given to Adam and Eve in the garden. I think that gets finally, fully fulfilled in eternity. Because we're going to reign with Christ, not as passive spectators of some ethereal existence, but as restored image, bearers exercising exactly the function we were created for from the beginning. And I don't think that's just poetic language or an empty metaphor with no real content. The task Adam and Eve were given in Genesis 1, and which they failed to carry out faithfully, that same task is perfectly fulfilled by redeemed humanity in Revelation 22. The story comes full circle, from beginning to end. What was lost in Eden isn't just restored to some previous state, as if simply hitting a reset button. It's at the end of the day, elevated, increased, glorified beyond what it originally was. And we don't just go back to the garden as if the story ended where it began. We move forward to the city, the New Jerusalem, a more complex, more glorious, more definitive place than the original garden, where God dwells fully with his people, and we reign with him forever and ever without end. And if you notice, there's an additional detail in Revelation 21, a chapter earlier, that reinforces this connection even further. The description of the New Jerusalem is deliberately loaded with language evoking Eden. There's a tree of life. There's a crystal, clear river. There's God's direct presence walking among his people, exactly as he walked in the garden before the fall. But the text also adds elements Eden never had. A city with streets, with gates, with precious foundations, with entire nations bringing their glory into it. It's as if the author of Revelation is deliberately saying, this isn't just going back to the beginning. This is the beginning plus everything humanity, faithfully imaging God along the way, should have built in the meantime culture, city, civilization, all of it redeemed and brought into God's presence instead of discarded. And I think this profoundly changes what we imagine when we think about eternity. Your destiny, if you're in Christ, isn't to sit passively on a cloud playing a harp for eternity, a cliché that doesn't even actually appear in the biblical text. It's not to be absorbed, dissolved into some impersonal spiritual oneness with the divine nature, erasing your individual identity. It's to finally and fully be who you were always meant to be since Genesis 1, a faithful image, bearer of God, carrying His name with visible honor, exercising wise dominion over restored creation, in perfect, unhindered relationship with your Creator and with the rest of His redeemed people. At least that's what the text seems to be pointing toward, with pretty consistent force from beginning to end of the biblical narrative. That's the future for those who are God's image, bearers, restored in Christ. So, here's why I think all of this genuinely matters, or at least why it's been so meaningful for me to see things this new way. Understanding that we are the images of God, image bearers, His representatives, this gives a solid framework for human dignity that doesn't depend on what you can do or what you productively contribute to society. It's not about your abilities, your economic usefulness, your productivity, your IQ, or your physical capacity. It's about what you are at your deepest essence. In every human being at every stage of development, in every condition of health or sickness, with any level of cognitive or physical ability, everyone, without a single exception, carries this identical, inalienable status. This small shift in perspective, from capacity to status, from possession to function, has some pretty big and pretty concrete real life implications, because it means every human life has inherent dignity and worth that can't be measured, increased, or diminished by any circumstance. It means racism isn't just wrong in some abstract moral sense. It is, honestly, a direct, frontal assault on the image of God present in another human being, an assault, ultimately, against the very God that person represents. It means the vulnerable and the disabled, the unborn still in the womb and the elderly at the end of life, those suffering severe mental illness and those in comas. All of them equally bear the image, deserving the same honor and the same protection, not because of what they can do or produce, but simply because of what they are from the first instant of their existence. And this also gives a sense of purpose much bigger and much more stable than simply finding yourself, or pursuing personal happiness, or accumulating wealth and recognition, the default goals the culture around us tends to push as life's ultimate meaning. If we're here, fundamentally, to represent God accurately, to reflect His character in our daily relationships, to exercise wise stewardship over His world, over the creation entrusted to us, that's an extraordinarily meaningful job, even when carried out in life's most common, seemingly small everyday tasks. And it's something genuinely worth building an entire life around. Think about how this changes, for example, the way we view ordinary work that doesn't seem spiritual at first glance. If imaging God is about exercising wise dominion over creation on his behalf, then an engineer designing a safe bridge is, in a very concrete way, exercising that dominion mandate, bringing order where there was chaos, care where there was risk. A teacher helping a kid learn to read is shaping another image, bearer to better carry out their own calling. A farmer cultivating the land is literally participating in the original mandate to subdue the earth, given in Genesis 1:28. None of that work needs an explicit religious veneer to be, at its core, an act of faithful imaging. That, to me, dignifies ordinary work in a way the traditional split between secular life and spiritual life simply can't capture. And the reverse is just as true, maybe even more uncomfortable to admit. If every interaction I have is an opportunity to carry God's name well or poorly, then there's no compartment of my life that's truly neutral or off the radar. The way I drive in traffic, the way I treat a waiter who got my order wrong, the way I talk about a coworker behind their back, all of that is technically carrying the name. And I'll admit, when I started taking this idea seriously, it made me a lot more aware of things I used to consider too small to matter. The name-bearing thing is also convicting in a way that's honestly uncomfortable when I really think it through. Because if I claim to follow Jesus publicly, if I carry God's name as a Christian in front of my neighbors, coworkers, and family, then my life should probably, in some consistent way, even if gradual and imperfect, reflect that reality I'm professing with my mouth. Not perfectly, look, I'm definitely not saying that, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But directionally, more and more over time, how I treat the people around me, especially the ones who have nothing to offer me in return, how I use the financial resources and time God gave me, how I talk about God to other people in casual conversation, or even just how I generically talk to strangers in traffic or at the grocery store, all of that is, in fact, carrying his name all the time. And I sincerely want to keep doing that better. And then there's this future dimension I find genuinely compelling, one that changes how I think about everyday things like work and purpose. The idea that in Revelation 22, we're not just going to float around in some ethereal spiritual realm disconnected from matter, but actually reign with Christ in a physically restored creation, exercising that dominion mandate from Genesis, one the way it was always meant to happen, without the tragic interruption of the fall. There's something so beautiful about that to me, about the entire biblical story coming full circle, from garden to city, about everything that was broken being restored, and then elevated beyond what it originally was, without losing anything gained along the way. And look, maybe I'm wrong about some of the specific details of this image-bearing question. I try to be honest about that throughout this channel, because serious scholars still debate the exact details of this Hebrew grammar. But I think this broader framework, this way of understanding what it means to be made in the image of God as status and function rather than capacity and possession, makes sense of a lot for me, in a way the other readings simply couldn't fit together. It connects Genesis with the rest of the entire biblical story, from Exodus to the prophets, from the Gospels to Revelation, in a way that feels genuinely coherent, not forced. and it gives a vision of human purpose and final destiny for every person that feels, at the same time, ancient, rooted in a text thousands of years old, and somehow completely fresh and renewed to me today. So, I don't know, I thought this might be interesting for you to think about too. It's one of those topics where the more you dig in, the more connections you find scattered across the whole canon, and the more significant it becomes with every layer you peel back. So that's what it means, at least as I understand it today after all this research, to be made in the image of God. Not some hidden capacity inside you that can grow or shrink, but a status given by God, unchangeable, that you carry from the first instant of your existence into eternity. Thank you so much for watching. And I want to hear from you. Had you ever heard this reading of image as status and representation instead of internal capacity? Or is this a completely new idea for you too, the way it was for me when I started this research? Does this change how you read Genesis 1 going forward? Let me know in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you all think about this, and whether you agree with this reading or lean toward one of the more traditional explanations we looked at earlier in the video. If you enjoyed this deep dive, consider subscribing to the channel. It's free, and it really helps us keep producing this kind of investigation into the most overlooked and misunderstood parts of the Bible. You guys are the best. I'll probably make a dedicated video just on Jesus as the perfect image, bearer, and what that means for the theology of the incarnation, because there's a lot more layer there than I could cover today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.